to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I am a USA Today bestselling author with over 30 published novels and a high school English teacher as well. And on this week's episode, I am excited to have a local writer here with us talking about her debut book. So we're going to be talking to Paper Robin about her YA fantasy Knowhere, and that is spelled Knowhere, to make sure that you guys can find it when you go look it up later. So let's say hello. Paper, go ahead and introduce yourselves to our listeners.
I'm Paper Robin, and I wrote this book. The first version of this book I actually wrote when I was 12 years old, and then I went back and rewrote it and self-published it on Amazon. Yeah, I'm 19 years old, and I love writing.
Thank you for coming on the show this week. Tell us what the book's about, and then maybe how that changed over the course of rewriting it. Because I kind of had a similar experience with the start of my writing career, of writing my first book at 15, 16. I think I completely rewrote it 3 different times before I was like, okay, this is ready now.
Yeah.
So yeah, give us an idea of what is the premise of the book, and then we can kind of jump in and talk a little bit about how that changed over the course of being 12 and your ideas about it, and that growing with you over time.
Yeah, so the book is basically, it's a fantasy novel. And it's about a boy named Alexander who travels to this magical world called Knowhere, where he has to face several different villains and challenges, but the main one is a villain named the Shadow Man.
And we'll get into kind of how you constructed your world, maybe where some of your inspirations came from, because we have a lot of characters in addition to Alexander. But what was your initial inspiration for the story as a young adult yourself? And then how did that grow and develop over that course of, 5-6 years of you learning more about writing and developing the idea more in your head?
Basically, when I first wrote this book, when I was, 12 years old, the inspiration actually came from just several different things and ideas, but I actually had a dream, which I know a lot of people always say that, but like a dream, and it had 2 of these characters in it, and I was like, that's a really fun story as I was thinking back on it, and I started thinking about, okay, how would this work, and how would the magic process go, and then after I wrote it, it took me a year and a half when I was 12, and then I didn't really think about it for a long time. I did write other books, or actually sequels that will be coming out eventually, but then I came back when COVID hit, actually, and I was like, I should rewrite that, get that ready to self-publish since I don't have anything else to do. And going back on it was kind of crazy because, the nonsense of a 12-year-old, right? Trying to figure it out and put everything back together and actually make things make sense and build a world. It almost felt like I was starting from scratch with a very rough outline. It took me many years to get it done.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. There's a lot you think about as a young person, because I started writing pretty young as well. And it was just a lot of oh, that's cool. Let's put that in. And that sounds fun. And I like this and I like that. And you just kind of mash a lot of things into a story at times. Don't maybe necessarily have a concept of story arcs and developing characters in intentional ways so that they reach their goal and gain the skills and knowledge and all of that. You learn a little bit more of the process of writing as you mature yourself, as you're exposed to more types of literature. For me, that was something that's my early writing was just wow, here's things I think are cool and putting them all together and stuff. It's an interesting experience to look back on some of that and be like, oh my gosh, that was terrible. What was I even doing?
Yeah.
But it sounds like the bones were still there when you went back through this, that you found aspects that you wanted to keep and develop in and dive into a little bit more.
Yes, definitely. That's exactly, you go back and you're like, why was this here? This doesn't make any sense. It was purely because I thought it was cool when I was 12. And I was like, that's fun. And then now I have to go back and future me is being punished. That's what it almost feels like. Because they have to figure out how to make sense of this nonsense. But yeah, the bones were there, and I had the structure, I had the basis of the story. I knew the start, the end, the outline, how everything was going to go and why it was going to go that way. it was a little bit problematic because I had to stay true to some things that I wasn't sure if I wanted to, if that makes sense, because like I said, I'm actually working on the drafts for the next books. I'm on draft 4 right now, book 4. And some things that happen in this book I had to stay true to because in the future it affects the story. And so sometimes that was very difficult to handle and to figure out, and like, how could I make that make sense, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I've definitely run into problems like that where I'm not always very good at outlining, and I try to do a little bit better about that now. But, you start a series and you have some ideas that work within that one book, and then you get later on and you're like, oh, dang, I really should have maybe changed something back in book 1 for this to make more sense now. But it's out there, even though, with self-publishing, you have control of being able to like go back and fix something that you maybe couldn't do if it's with a traditional publisher and you're beyond that point. But even so, it's like people have read it. You have to go back and make big changes sometimes to everything else just to change one thing that might work better later on. And maybe sometimes you're like, I don't really want to do that whole thing. So how did you kind of maneuver around the drafts that you're working on now where you ran into some issues? Did you have to make big changes to what you're doing in the later books? Or were you able to kind of work it together in a way where it worked out for both what was already out in Knowhere and what you were planning to do in the later story?
Most of it was changes in the first book, but some of it was actually going back to my other drafts and changing things that happened, because sometimes I didn't fully remember what happened in the first book, and I'm like, oh, but I need to keep that or something like that. And I'm like, so this is going to be affected in the future. And it kind of messes with your head, because you're like, your whole like timeline in your head, something's going off course and you're like, that's not how it happened. You're like, wait, that is how it happened. And so mostly I feel like it's nice because it comes together once you're done and finished. But it was definitely a lot of sitting there like with all my books and like changing each one with little things and like little sentences and just going back and forth till everything fit together properly.
It is a bit of a process, but I'm glad you were able to kind of bring all the pieces together in a way that you were happy with. Did you have readers who helped you with that, as far as, friends or family who have read the drafts and kind of given some feedback, or was this mainly kind of a process you were working through on your own?
I actually do have a few people. I have 2 sisters who actually read all my drafts, every chapter by the chapter when I read it or write it, and they'll give me feedback and tell me things like, oh, I didn't expect that, or like, that's kind of strange and everything. And a lot of times I'll change some things and I'll be like, yeah, that's probably right. And then I also, for the book 1, my main editor was actually another one of my sisters. She was my older sister, but she did a lot of English and all that. And her name's Tylee Hansen, and she did so much. She was probably the number 1 person to help me with all that and making things make sense and just flat out everything about the story. But
That's awesome. Well, it's nice to have people who are able to help out in that way in your family. That's a hard group of people to find just out in the wild at times.
Yes, definitely.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the world that you created. I think that's one of the more fun parts of doing anything kind of fantasy, sci-fi, paranormal, is building the world that your characters get to exist in, and that you've got to fit your story into whatever rules you've developed for the world. And you have some really interesting aspects of the world of Knowhere that you've created. So tell us a little bit about what Knowhere is like and how you developed it.
Knowhere is created as another world that used to be kind of a part of Earth. So in the beginning, in the story, Earth was 2 different worlds, but the humans got jealous of the mythics, which is wizards, mages. These species are called wonders, and like all magical humanoids. And they got jealous of their magic and everything, the humans did. So they started this like war trying to take their magic, and it ended up separating the worlds, where they kind of like blocked off any teleportation to Knowhere, which is the second world. And it divided them to somewhere in Knowhere. So now they're 2 separate places. But in Knowhere is where there's all the magic, because that's where all the magical creatures went. And there's different types of species of humans in Knowhere. and there's different animals, and there's dragons, and there's griffins, and there's magic, which the magic is from wizards and mages, but there's like two different types of magic. There's the mages and wizards magic, which is where you use like physical thing, like you move your hands and magic comes out, or you clap twice and something sprouts from the earth. And then there's sorcerers and witches magic, which is speaking magic. So when you cast a spell out loud, like a chant or something, that's the sorcerers and wizards magic. And that's a lot to swallow, but
yeah. Well, and you built a system where it kind of gave me tiny bits of like Wheel of Time, where there are consequences for using the speaking magic. And I think that my guess is that in your later books, you'll get into a little bit more of like why and how that all works and everything. But it comes into play a little bit in this first book, where as Alexander is learning about the world and the different powers that people has, he's kind of introduced to some of the rules and consequences of the different magics that people use. So how did you decide and work that into the story of what magic might cost people, or how that is going to impact the story and the characters involved?
How I came up with how this is going to get involved and everything was the consequences of using wizard or mage magic, which is the physical one, isn't very costly. It's just like physical, like you get strained, like when you go for a run, you get tired. But the sorcerer and witch's magic is more powerful because when you speak, it doesn't use energy like the same, and so it corrupts people because it becomes almost too much power, and it uses your brain, which actually kind of starts leading you to go insane. And so how this affects the people in the story is some people are sorcerers while their kids might not be. So or their children might be. So how Alexander, you come to find out, is a sorcerer, but his uncle is not. He is a wizard, but Alexander's grandfather is also a sorcerer. And it affects all these people because of the different ways that magic hurts and harms other people, and the ways that some people do not possess it the same way and doesn't understand how it goes.
And that seems to be, in part, some of the background, I guess, that led up to the war and the division of the two worlds. Kind of that fear.
Yes.
Those that have versus those that don't. In reality, throughout history, that's often a source of conflict in many ways. And you bring that in here with that fear that causes division between the two worlds. And then you still kind of see some of the lingering effects of that in the story in book one here, where there's a little bit of mistrust or fear of getting too involved or too close, depending on what the type of magic is. And that's kind of caused some relationship issues with some of the characters. I wanted to ask you about how you blended that magic system that you developed to interact with the character relationships, which then, of course, influences the overall story. Was that something either initially or as you were doing your revisions later that you planned out and was very intentional, or was that something that as you were building and developing the world, you started seeing those come into play just as you were working?
Kind of a bit of both. So when I wrote it, I was thinking, because I've used, real life experiences to try to figure out. And I actually want to be a marine archaeologist. So I do really like history and everything. And I look into that stuff. And I noticed how, like you were saying with the relationships and everything, how much years and years later, even like now in our times, how wars that have happened in the past lead to distrust hundreds of years later. And I was like, I wanted to incorporate that into my story. But yeah, it went way farther than I expected. Kind of like when you've probably had this, where almost the story writes itself in a way. Mm-hmm. And there's tension between characters that you're like, oh, I didn't fully realize that was going to be there and everything. And slowly you kind of just let it, and as it progresses and grows, you kind of realize, so it was some intentional, because when I rewrote it, it was 100% intentional. I already had a bunch of these plans and drafted, but when it was first coming about, it definitely went a little bit different course than I expected.
think it's always an interesting part of writing is that sometimes your subconscious is doing a lot of work you don't realize it's doing until you
Yeah.
go back for revisions or someone else points it out and you're like, oh yeah, I did do that.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
it's like, it's not necessarily like an accident or, anything like that, but I think it's things that are kind of swimming around in our thoughts and our ideas as we're working that works its way onto the page in a way that, like, yeah, maybe we didn't sit down and say, okay, plot point 3 is where this relationship conflict is going to develop because of the war that happened a century ago.
Yeah.
But as you're working and developing and getting to know those characters, like, I think a lot of that does come through as you, the writer, like, gets to the point where you understand the characters in the world well enough that the pieces start coming together, even when it's maybe not a conscious, intentional thing. You've got a lot of that built up in your world and in your thoughts to where that does come through. And then I love that you can build on that and maybe perfect or clean up or, whatever is needed to kind of really make those things stand out. But I think there's a lot to that of just letting yourself kind of put in these elements as you're going, whether you know if it's going to work out or not in the moment, seeing which ones play out over time after you do those revisions and get feedback. I think a lot of those, if you take like a Bob Ross approach to it, those little happy accidents can be
Yeah.
really great additions to a story.
Yeah, definitely. Not being afraid of having to rewrite a chapter, I think, is the biggest thing. Like, yeah, basically not being afraid of a revision. Like, not being like, oh, I can't add this and this because it might not work out or it might not end up or I might not like it in the future. It's like, just add it. Don't be afraid.
Yeah, it
And
can
you can
always be
always go back
changed.
and fix it.
Mhm,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, and I wanted to ask you about your characters as well, because you have a fairly large cast, which I
Yes.
think is more common in more fantasy-based stories. A lot of times you'll, if you're in a class or a workshop or something, sometimes that's discouraged, especially with new projects. Like, don't have too many characters, like, keep it pared down, keep it manageable. But you really needed a pretty good sized cast of characters, because not only is there a lot of the world and how it works that needs to be introduced through different characters, there's a lot of complexity in what's going on and the history of everybody that, had you tried to do that with like 4 people, that would have been very challenging to get everything in that you needed to get in. So tell me a little bit about how you decided on the number of characters and how you managed that cast that you ended up with.
At first, sometimes it still does, a bit daunting with the giant cast. As you said, a lot of people are always like, you should narrow it down some, and like trying to keep everything straight and also keeping it where it doesn't get confusing for the reader. Because like you might be able to keep it straight and figure it out, but the reader might not be able to, So I ended up going for a big cast because like you said, the world, I was introducing in a whole entire world, and there's not just like 5 people in a world, and the fact that one of the characters, Edmund Doors, he actually has been in this world before. So coming back, I was like, he also had to have known people and had to have talked to different people, and I couldn't just like completely scratch that out, like no one knew who he was because he was here before. And then I also have a bunch of backstory in the story with him in it and all the other characters. And so it just kept getting broader and broader. But then I was like, okay, the best way to control this is I basically had 3 different perspectives, as you saw. We have Alexander Doors' perspective, which he's the main perspective. And then we have, well, sometimes it goes a little broader than that, but the 3 main ones is Alexander Doors, and then we have Summer's perspective, and then we have the backstory, which is mainly told from Edmund's perspective. And then, here and there we have like one of the villain's perspectives or someone else's perspective just for a little bit, a shadow or something, just to keep the story going so you understand what's happening over there. But I try to keep it very much on those so that people could focus, kind of, so they're not like getting thrown across the room all the time. Like, oh, we're going over here now, and now we're going over here, and let's learn about this random dude in the corner. Just kidding. But so that was my strategy of doing that, and I'm really proud of how it turned out. I remember even being when I was 12, being scared that it wouldn't work out, and I'd have to take away a lot of people. And some people were still taken away out of the story, but it turned out okay, and I was really happy about that.
Yeah, I thought it wasn't too overwhelming to have 20 perspectives or something like that, which, somehow can work in some places. Again, like Wheel of Time, I don't even know how many different perspectives you get throughout that series, and there's 8 bazillion characters, and that one was at times really hard to keep track of what was going on with who. But but yeah, I think keeping with, like you said, the 3 main and then the occasional other perspectives. One thing that I thought was interesting is classically in, I want to say 70s and 80s and maybe a little bit into 90s era, like epic fantasy, that omniscient narrator was kind of the more standard, more popular way of telling a story, because the narrator could bounce between a big variety of characters and you weren't locked in. And when you've got like a whole lot going on, you often need that, because you need that one guy for 2 pages who's going to observe something that's really important to the story, and you wouldn't be able to know that otherwise because, one of the main characters didn't observe it or interact with it. And that's always a challenge, I think, with big casts and epic fantasy or, space opera type of things, where you've got a lot of settings, a lot of people, a lot of subplots going on. It's really challenging to keep it all organized and not lose the reader halfway through on things. Yeah. Did you read a lot of fantasy growing up? Is that kind of where your interest in this particular genre came from?
Yes, I did. I read, the classic Harry Potter and everything, but my favorite series, I can actually see it on my shelf right now, is Love and Thumps. I don't know if you ever read that.
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, I loved it. It's still my favorite, and I still go back. It's a 5-book series, and it does quite a bit of that bouncing too. Not tons, not like my book, but it does jump around in perspective. I've always loved that series. I always loved fantasy. I've always read fantasy. Very rarely has it ever been anything else, and especially if it's fictional, I don't think I've basically read anything else except for fantasy. Maybe like 1 or 2 books, but I just love it. And yeah, so always been my obsession.
That helps you be familiar with the conventions that go along with that. And that may have been something at age 12, maybe you weren't like completely conscious of. But as you were going back through and rewriting and tweaking and finalizing this, how much of your reading experience played into polishing and rewriting this, and not mimicking or taking from, but just that familiarity with what fantasy readers want? Was that something that as you were reworking this and as you're going through your drafts that you're working on now, is that something that you're very conscious of, or do you kind of take your own path on some of those, of maybe breaking conventions at times?
Yeah, so I actually at one point even had a little journal because I was writing these books, and I would write down little things that I liked about the fantasy books. So I'd be like, oh, this is a bestseller, and I'd read it, and I'd be like, oh, I think it's good because of this and this and this. And I'm like, I really liked how the plot twists were. And then something I got obsessed over for a while was, and you see it more in the other books when they'll come out, but how villains were developed and how it would trigger me when a villain wasn't well developed, or when something didn't make much sense and someone was just angry to be angry, kind of. For a while, I was very conscious, and I was like, I'm going to put this in my book and this in my book. And then eventually that just kind of burnt me out, and I'm like, it was stressing me out too much. Like I was trying to make it someone else's book, and I'm like, this is my book. I can kind of, so then I started being like, well, I want to add this. So even if it doesn't seem like it's in much fantasy books, it's going to be in my book. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how it went. So it was a bit of both. So for a while it was very conscious, and then eventually it kind of became charting my own path.
I think that's so important to read critically. If you want to be a writer, I think that's one of the best ways you can learn about writing, is to read and to think about what you're reading. Like you said, what do I like? Why do I like it? What kept me engaged? All of that. And then branching out from there and developing your own style. I think most writers kind of start out, and I think musicians and artists and all of that, you start out with what you enjoy, what you know, you mimic, especially in art, you do master studies when you're first starting out. I don't know how many times I painted a famous work of art, and it gives you something where you've got the structure, you've got the form there, and then you're trying to develop the skills that would help you create that. And it's like once you develop those base skills, then you can start exploring and trying new techniques and doing your own more inventive things to help develop your style. But it's really a process to do that. It's not, well, at least I think for most people, maybe there might be some people out there who just first time writing, they have a really unique personal style that's on point and they know exactly what they're doing.
Yeah.
But I think most of us need to learn that over time.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that would be like winning the lottery, like someone does, but most people.
Takes a bit more time.
Yeah.
Well, and tell us I just looked at the clock, we're already starting to get short on time, but tell us a little bit about what you have planned for the rest of the series that you're working on and what we can keep an eye out for.
Yes, okay. So I'm very excited. I'm getting the second one's draft. I'm starting to get it prepared. It'll still be like probably another year or so till it's out. But it's very exciting. But yeah, what to look out for is, I don't want to give too much away, but it's, yeah, there's so much, like, I don't know if you noticed, but there's so much that isn't fully explained in the first book. There's all these ideas and stories that are going to be going in to come back and loop those things around. And I didn't forget about anything. Like my sister who reads the books as they're by chapter, like she's on draft 4. We were just talking about how there's one sentence in the first book that is actually answered in the 4th book by another like 2 or 3 sentences. So I don't forget about anything. So if there's questions in there and you're like, well, what does that mean? Or it will be answered. And I'm very excited. And yeah, think about it's all going to be super magical, super fantasy. And there's going to be 4 more books. That's the plan.
Oh, that's awesome. And that's great that you're able to keep track and have someone who can help you keep track of things. I think that's always the hardest thing for me with my writing is finishing a series. Yeah. Doing that last book, because I get stuck on like, is there anything I forgot? Did everything make sense? Did I tie up all the loose ends and answer all the questions? And it'll cause me to be like, get really stressed out trying to finish the last book in a series. So I'm glad you have someone that can help you with that and make sure nothing gets left out. Because I really enjoyed that the first book was a really great introduction. And it has its own complete story arc and everything. But it felt like an introduction to the world. And there's a lot more to dig into and discover and have fun with over the rest of the series. So I'm glad that there will be more. And that some of those lingering ideas and questions from book 1 are all going to be wrapped up over the course of the next 4 books. That's exciting.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, and as I said, we are about the time to start wrapping up already. But I just wanted to remind our listeners that the book is called Knowhere, and that is by Paper Robin, and it's currently available on Amazon. Is there anywhere else that people can find the book or find you? I know you said you kind of have some stuff in the works that isn't quite ready yet, but I wanted to make sure we gave a shout out to anywhere else that you might want to point people.
Not currently, just Amazon. I am working on getting it on Barnes & Noble, but it's not quite there yet. So eventually Barnes & Noble. But yeah, just for now, it's on Amazon. Yeah, just look up Knowhere with a K by Paper Robin, and it'll be the first thing to pop up. I also did the cover art on it.
That's awesome. And are you planning to do the cover art for the rest of the books as well?
Yes, that's the plan.
Oh, very nice. All right. Well, I would love to have you back and hear more when you're ready to talk about the next book coming out. So we'll stay in contact. But in the meantime, thank you for taking the time to come on the show and talk about your book and your plans for the future.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such an honor. I was so excited.